Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the All Saints podcast. I'm here with Pastor Drew Maney. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Pastor Maney is visiting us in Fort Worth this week. As those of you who are All Saints know, he's doing some teaching for us. We've heard him preach last Sunday. He's preaching for us tonight. It's Wednesday morning as we record this, and it's just been a blast getting to know you. And we have a shared love for Ken Myers, which kind of didn't surprise me, but he's not a character who is particularly familiar, probably, to some of our members here at All Saints, and yet he will be very familiar to others. And I thought it would just be great to sit and chat with you about some of the things that you've learned from him, what you've enjoyed about him, why you listen to him. Cards on the table, I used to listen to his Mars Hill audio journal regularly, and I stopped in about 2020, didn't renew my subscription, but I recently restarted it, and
there you go.
So I thought, okay, this is interesting, and I now remember why I loved it so much.
Yeah.
So Ken Myers, who he, and why'd you like him?
Yeah, I don't know too much about his background. I do know that he went to Westminster Seminary kind of early on in his career and education. He worked for NPR. I think his undergraduate is in film or something like that. So he's kind of always been in the media realm. Worked for NPR for a while, and then started, got the idea to have a cultural commentary from a Christian perspective. And he developed Mars Hill Audio. So it's a bi-monthly audio journal, and then every week he sends out like a Friday feature, I think he calls it. So yeah. And one of the things I love about it is that it is so far-reaching. That's probably the first thing. Every aspect of culture, music, art, science, films, just you could go on and on and on, listing all of these different, cultural artifacts and whatnot. At some point, he's going to talk about them. And then, so that's the first thing. It's very, very far-reaching. But then his approach is I just absolutely love it, because he doesn't really talk about the surface level issues. He gets really, really down deep, and he interviews subject matter experts on, these different fields. They've all kind of done work in their respective field, and he interviews them to kind of bring out, really insightful commentary on things that are happening today. So it's not just, hey, something happened yesterday, some sort of thing that you might read in the news, and let's talk about that, like you might look at, the modern, Fox News or CNN or whatever. Mm-hmm. He'll talk about current events, but always at a very, very deep theological and philosophical level.
Yeah.
And it really just helps you understand, like, not just the thing at the top, the surface level issue, but the first principles that are really at play.
Yeah.
I think he had some connection, I don't remember exactly, with Richard Newhouse, who started First Things. With that whole principle is kind of, pervasive in Ken Myers' work. I would say it to me is tremendously helpful in thinking about it, in cultivating like a good way to think critically about our culture, as opposed to just kind of reacting and responding. He, just the way that he does his show teaches you to be more of a deep thinker about the issues that are at play.
I like that way of framing the cultural commentary piece, because, two thoughts occur to me. One is I remember quite recently reading a comment from Peter Leithartian, who said that he thought Ken Myers was unparalleled. I think that's the word he used. He may have used a similar word, but unparalleled as a cultural critic.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting, because as I'd listened to Ken, he talked a lot about aesthetics and music, and he did talk about theology and contemporary cultural ideas. But then I started to think again. I thought, he is talking about culture in the sense of what shapes culture. He's not talking about what happened last week, but he is profoundly interesting and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
But the time scale point that you made, I think, is really worth reflecting on in a bit more detail, because what's actually happening, I almost think of it like analogously with investment horizons. There is, if you talk to a good investment advisor, they'll tell you, okay, the long term, super long term, like 5 decades, is kind of certain, because free trade works, and because God is triune, and because of the creation mandate. If you buy shares in a company that's well run, they're going up over 50 years. They'll also say short term is completely irrelevant. Like, you should uninstall all the trading apps from your phone, because otherwise you're going to be concerned about what happens on a day-to-day and week-to-week timescale in a way that you should not be concerned.
Absolutely.
But there's an intervening time horizon, which is, okay, what are the likely trends in the last couple of years, and how are they going to shape things going forward? Have there been significant legislative changes, or significant moves in capital allocation between industries or regions? And it's that kind of time scale which, it seems to me, it's, from a Christian point of view, it's hardest to commentate on in every domain. Let's think now about Christian culture. It's hardest to commentate on because there's no shortage of more ephemeral back and forth on an hour by hour and day by day time scale. And therefore it's very easy just to jump in and be opinionated. And nobody ever notices if you're wrong, because, hey, it's just a back and forth. In the long term, if all we say is, well, in the long term, Jesus is going to win, well, that's baked in. We know that already. But we actually live our lives meaningfully on this sort of 1 to 2 to 3 to 5 year time scale. And for somebody to be thinking, how can we orient ourselves so that we're aware of both trends happening around us on that kind of time scale, and how we should position ourselves so that, what could we do now that will make our families, our churches, our workplaces more faithful and fruitful 6, 12, 18 months out, 2, 3 years out? That's really, really valuable. And it's at that point that you do need to think more deeply. Right? I mean, so I've heard him talk about the place of music, and the nature of freedom, and aesthetics. And I'd love just to jump into one or more of those topics, or anything else that you have been particularly grabbed by recently, and maybe we just try and share with our listeners and viewers how those insights ought to shape our own way of thinking about our lives in the world.
Well, there's a lot there. I think, as you were talking, and maybe this kind of connects a couple of those things together. He wrote a book, it's been a while thing. I don't remember exactly when it was written, called All God's Children and Blue Suede Shoes. Fantastic little book. And it's basically, I think at the end, or maybe a little bit later, he makes this chart of where he contrasts pop culture with, I don't remember the title that he gives it exactly, but basically like a true culture, a culture that has
a faithful culture
that has, all kinds of cultural artifacts, whether it's in music or in poetry and food and dance and all of these things, ideas about politics, ideas about the faith or religion, if it's a different one, and how these things are passed down from generation to generation. Whereas a pop culture, which I think the first, if I recall, the first kind of big section of the book is essentially just about basically saying that we live in a pop culture, that we could care less about the things that we have inherited, and we just those are the old things, and everything, all of our decisions are made based upon what we think about the here and now, or what's the super popular thing, or whatever. You could go on and on, and I mean, that book, which I would highly recommend, really kind of recalibrates your thinking a little bit, to stop being so obsessed with, the latest and the greatest, whether that's, an actual physical artifact or the latest and greatest controversy, or you could go on and on. And to start thinking in terms of what have we inherited? How do we think about the world? What things do we value? What things do we pursue as families and societies? Things like that. And then what's our current situation, and how do we kind of bring all of those things to the present? I don't know if that exactly kind of got it, what you were talking about.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
And maybe we ground this a little bit. I mean, your observation about the difference between pop culture, which is that in Meyer's way of thinking, and actually he's picking up on more general cultural analytics themes here. Pop culture has as one of its distinctive features a rejection of tradition and history and the past, which obviously we can see is problematic in terms of going back generations and hundreds of years. Are there particular things you think, as you look back over your life and your experiences in the past, where you think, yeah, that was something that I could or should have or did learn from maybe a family member or an uncle or a neighbour, that actually would really profoundly help you to grow and to be a stable cultural influence? Are there things that stick in your mind like that? Are role models who are really meaningful for you?
Yeah, well, I think I was actually fairly fortunate in a lot of ways, because my family was kind of just had kind of a strong sense of familial identity, I guess. My grandfather was just everybody looked up to him, very, very capable man, and he kind of set the trajectory for a pretty neat family in a lot of ways. And so with that came lots of stories and lots of shared experiences and family traditions and things like that, that I'm excited to teach my kids and to pass along to my kids. I think so on a unfortunately, it wasn't as much of kind of a Christian, line of thinking, but I think that, to me has been very, very helpful in thinking about ways that we can think about our own family culture, our own church culture, as being, something that's not against necessarily the culture in the world, but it's certainly, these are the fruits of the new creation that we're trying to embody, and that means looking back on things and being appreciative for the things that we've been taught and whatnot. So I'm trying to think of specific things to answer your question better.
Yeah, I think of my family sounds like rather like yours. Most of my immediate ancestors were not believers. Some of them were, but not many. But I think both on my mum and my wife's side, my wife's family, and my family, there were examples of real industriousness. My uncle was a coal miner, and there's a whole bunch of stories behind that, and it's quite a depressed economic and social region in England where he and his family came from, and there's all kinds of social carnage there, and it certainly wasn't a Christian environment. But boy, did he know how to work hard.
Absolutely.
Going half a mile down underground and hacking coal out of the ground with machines in the dark and with pickaxes on occasion. It's just there's something there that most of us are unfamiliar with, mercifully.
Yeah, and so getting back, I think, to your question, so you have that, and I would similar stories, not in a coal mine, but similar stories. You have that as a backdrop, and so when you encounter something today, then you're always thinking, well, man, this is tough, but old grandpa or great uncle so and so, man, he had to, he really had to work hard. This is nothing compared to what he had. And so, and It's helpful because we're constantly shaped by, the narratives that are the normal media gives us about work and about what's good work and follow your heart sort of things and whatnot. And so you have to be able to counter that, and you might not even know exactly what to say to counter the narrative that the media pushes.
Yeah.
But you have all of these experiences and stories and whatnot that are just kind of forming the way that your disposition and just kind of your outlook on things.
The countercultural point, I think, is really fascinating because there's a way of being countercultural that isn't. What I mean by that is, just take today's media, and it goes back to the time scale thing.
Yeah.
As well as bringing in other thoughts, that today's media has a certain ideological standpoint, most of the mainstream media, and it pervades that standpoint in a certain way in relation to events on a certain time scale. So the mainstream media is mostly progressive, highly reactionary and short-termist, shrill, and overreactive. And it strikes me that a lot of the time when Christians think we're being countercultural, we are pushing back only against the ideology. But we're doing so in a way that embraces all the other aspects of the mainstream response. We're not as countercultural as we realize.
That's a very good point.
And actually, in that way, we're becoming a form of what we claim to be pushing back against. It's like we may think we're scoring a goal against progressivism, but it's progressivism's game we're playing.
Yeah.
And the observation that we have to be concerned about the medium and not just the message. This is another thing he's picked up from Myers picked up from Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman. It's kind of all train of reflection. Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman, Ken Myers. And I think it was Marshall McLuhan who said the medium is the message.
The message, yeah.
Oh, he actually said the medium is the massage, and message. The point being that the medium shapes you, massages you into shape. And it strikes me as deeply ironic, almost perversely ironic, that some of our most astute and sharp Christian conservative countercultural voices embrace precisely the medium, which is part of the message that they claim to be pushing back against. And it's we need to do better than that in not just what we say, but how we say it and the framing within which we put it.
Yeah. So did he actually say massage?
Yeah. So if you read Marshall McLuhan, so I went back and chased up the references because I'm like that.
Yeah.
Right?
No.
So,
That's
I can't remember Marshall McLuhan's book. He's a media theorist,
right?
And it says the medium is the massage.
So that's just interesting because I've heard Jim Jordan talk about how the scriptures, it's not just the content of the scriptures. It's not just, but the form massages you to think a certain way. So that's why he is so big on seeing, the parallelisms in the Hebrew text in particular, and those things, they work on you. So it's not just about what these verses mean, but as you read them in a way that's close to the Hebrew text, or sing them in a way that's close to the Hebrew text, it's working on you too. It's massaging you to be and to think a certain way.
Yeah, that's in Leithart, isn't it? As well in deep exegesis.
That's right.
So Leithart has this analogy of a kernel and a husk. Like, think of a nut, and his point is that the great mistake in reading Scripture is to try and reduce it to the kernel and discard the husk, where the husk is the literary form, the poetic characteristics, the intricacy of its structure, the particular words that are used. And the mistake is to abstract from that a doctrine of justification or something.
Right.
There's not that there is no doctrine of justification.
Sure. Yeah.
The point is that
It's much more than that.
yeah, and it's the framing that matters. So as soon as this is a crazy thing, as soon as we think of it in relation to other disciplines, it's obvious to us if we just ask the questions in the right way. So, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and so on. I can't remember the whole poem. But that's not the same as saying you're really, really cute and I love you.
Exactly. Yeah.
The form conveys much more, and I wonder if that's a way of analysing our cultural heritage and our cultural pursuits that's really illuminating. So if you take another example, meals, right? What a meal is not reducible to macros.
Yeah.
You could get the same macros chugging a protein shake in the traffic on the way to work as you could eating bacon and eggs and French toast with your grandma's recipe with your wife and kids. It's a completely different phenomenon. Now, the example there, like Monday through Friday, like you've got to get to work. You're up early, you're at the door, and your kids are still in bed. Great, but there is some value in creating a culture where it's not just about chugging the food down as fast as you can.
Yeah.
I remember this being it's another thing that I learned from my wife actually way back in the early days of our marriage, and have relearned since, that if she spent routinely an hour or two, sometimes longer, thinking about and preparing a meal, and the kids and I come in from the various things we've been doing and it's gone in 8 minutes.
Right. Yeah.
For her that is insulting. Yeah. And quite rightly and understandably so, because she's preparing an expression of and a means to the formation of a Christian cultural maturation.
Yeah.
And that can't be done in 8 minutes. Yeah. It's the unspoken conversation. It's the unspoken gestures, and it's the conversation around the table. It's all those things that make that culture what it is.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking, I think it's in Neil Postman's book where he contrasts the Lincoln-Douglas debates with like a modern presidential debate or something.
Don't. It's painful, isn't it?
And that's like, he was writing in the 80s or something, you know.
He was concerned about television.
Yeah, and so,
like all four channels, how terrible that would be.
Yeah.
Right?
And then you fast forward, another 30, 40 years to today, and you're like, we have, so in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, it was like an hour speech, 45-minute response.
Yeah.
Hour, then the other guy gets an hour, and then it's just and unbelievable.
We're all hungry now, so let's go home for dinner, and we'll see you in an hour and a half. And everyone's like, okay, we're out of here.
Fantastic.
Freedom.
Yeah.
I remember being really struck by something Ken Meyer said about freedom, and we talked about this very briefly when we were walking down the road to grab these cups of coffee.
Yeah.
So maybe you have an idea of what I'm thinking about, but you've listened to Ken for as long as I have, if not longer. What have you learned from him about this topic?
Yeah. And this has been, I think, particularly in the last couple of years when kind of political theology has, kind of reemerged itself as a big, area of emphasis.
And understandably so.
Yeah. He has, I know he's interviewed, I'm not sure, he's probably, gleaned this from other places as well, but D.C. Schindler, a Roman Catholic philosopher, has written extensively on this, and I think quite well, from my understanding. But yeah, we tend to think of freedom only as, the lack of constraints. But then at the same time, there's also an understanding of freedom that where you are enabled to do the things that are in keeping with your nature, your created order, what you were
made to be.
And of course, I think you get kind of an understanding of that too when you think about just freedom from a biblical perspective. We are free from the bonds of sin, and that doesn't mean that we don't sin, obviously, but we're free from the chains of sin, and so we can live righteously and seek to imitate Jesus. And so he takes that understanding of freedom, maybe call it like a positive understanding of freedom or something, and he extends that into the political spheres as well. Yeah.
So let me try and reframe that and see if it's similar to how I think of it. Freedom needs to be articulated in relation to moral concerns about what's wise, a vision of the good, and created order, how we're meant to be, given how God has made us and what Scripture says. As an example I often think of, and I think this is my old friend and mentor and fellow elder, David Field, this is tweaking his illustration, if I remember. If somebody just sits down and freely eats bowls of live cockroaches, are they really free? And what that does is it highlights, it presses us to consider that there might be something else other than lack of external constraint that is an ingredient of what we really want to call freedom. So maybe what we say is, okay, there is a kind of freedom which is liberty in the sense of political liberty. Like, so you're not in prison, and you're not constrained by law from doing good things. And you're right. I'm sure that a lot of these discussions have arisen in the late 20th and early 21st century because those freedoms have been restricted. Yeah. So it's highly understandable that Christians should be frustrated by basically regulation that impinges upon legitimate freedoms.
Yeah.
And I remember back in the UK, over the years, there have been various concerns about constraints on homeschooling, which obviously is an issue for Christians because there aren't that many great Christian schools, and lots of Christians who want to give their kids, well, not lots actually, not a few thousands or maybe tens of thousands of Christians who want to give their kids a Christian education. Homeschooling is the only way that they can really do that, and so anything that impinged on that freedom would be destructive and bad for their families. So I suspect that we could easily list a whole cavalcade of ways in which we feel our freedom is being constrained. And then, of course, there are liberties that are granted that ought not to be granted. The liberty to constrain the freedom of a child in the womb by ending its life.
Yeah.
That there is a deeply disordered cluster of constraints that ought not to be there, and freedoms that actually are death dressed up as life in the political world.
Absolutely.
And so we maybe those are uppermost in our consciousness, and it's understandable. But what that does is it shrinks our definition of freedom, because the thing that we feel constrains us most of the time is actually the external stuff, and we fail to realize that what we really need to be doing alongside concerns for those external constraints is thinking, okay, what's inside me? What kind of person am I? What are my goals and desires? Do I have the wisdom to execute them fruitfully? And the truth is, a lot of the shackles that bind the lives of actual human beings, adult human beings, who I know, and I'm sure whom you know, in modern America, arise from foolish decisions they've made in the past. Yeah. It might be something as simple as, I never really worked hard at school and now I'm struggling to find work that can provide for my family. Well, there are governmental constraints which make it hard to do certain jobs, but really the issue is, there's a moral and intellectual formation that you now realise you are lacking. And there's many other dimensions of that kind along which freedom can't be exercised, then it's because of internal traits and internal immaturities.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. As you were kind of talking a bit about that a little bit, and then going back to the eating cockroaches example, I was thinking that one of the things that has always stuck me is Jim's analysis, and he gets this from I think originally from Gregory Dix, the Eucharistic, fourfold. Excuse me.
I love the way we can just talk about Jim, by the way, and everyone knows it's
Jim Jordan.
Jim
Sorry.
Jordan. Yeah, no,
Sorry,
you don't need to apologise.
Okay.
Around here, you can just say Jim.
There we go. Yeah. But he talks. When you look at the Eucharistic liturgy, and then in his book Primeval Saints, he shows that it's there in Genesis as well. But the ideal man, which before the fall, is not ideal. He needed to be glorified, obviously, but Adam, before the fall, was to take hold of creation and give thanks for it, and then break it and use it for the means of glorification, of service to God and service to his wife and then subsequent family. And I wonder if that's at least the baseline for freedom. So that guards against any sort of conception of, wanting to eat a bowl of cockroaches. God has given us this incredible world. He's put us with our own attributes in it, and we're to be thankful for that situation. And then all of our activity after that is a response of gratitude, basically. So everything that we do, whether we eat, whether it's eating or working or whatever, is basically a way in which we give thanks and serve one another. So I wonder if that could be like a starting point for that. That's true freedom.
Yes.
Understanding our creatureliness, that God in his love and grace has made us in his image.
Yeah.
To then serve him and love others, basically.
Well, I think that gratitude point is really helpful because it speaks equally to everybody. And at this point, it becomes a pastoral challenge, or a challenge even to repentance. So I tell you what I have in mind. I sketched a cameo a moment or two ago of someone whose freedom in the workplace is constrained by decisions they'd made in the past. That's actually true in different ways of far more people than we might imagine.
Yeah.
I'm sure you realise this. I know you do as a pastor. You'll have seen this. That there are some people whose career has gone just the way they wanted it to go. There are some, I expect, somewhere, right? But it's far more common that all of us think, I wish I'd done X because that would have put me in a better position now. Okay, so how do we appropriate that providence? And I think your deployment of the biblical idea of gratitude is profoundly significant. In other words, irrespective of the nature of God's providence, we are called to give thanks. Mm-hmm. So imagine the limiting case of someone who has really made some bad choices, let's say, to borrow some pop culture vernacular. Right? Yeah. Somebody who's not raised in a Christian home or who walked away from a Christian upbringing and has now reached a stage, maybe adult life, married, or maybe later adult life, 50, 60, and they just look at where they are now and think, jeepers, almost anything that I could have done previously would have put me in a better position than this. What do I do now? And as they draw breath and ask that question, they're drawing breath for which thanksgiving is due.
Yeah.
As they survey the landscape around them, they're surveying a landscape for which gratitude is appropriate.
Yeah.
And then, how are we going to use this opportunity?
Right.
For every day that we draw breath, is an opportunity. And I mean, this is where the modern pop psych literature is borrowing, one of the 1,001 places, borrowing from Christian teaching that you are where you are. Okay, so get up and use the opportunities you have. But that's an empty shadow of the biblical picture. If you think of it as God has created you in his wisdom and in his inscrutable, kind, sometimes painful providence, he's brought you through however many years to this point, and you wish you would happily exchange places with any one of 2 billion people around the world. Well, there are 4.5 billion people you don't want to exchange places with. Thank God for that for a start. But here you are. Yeah. What could you do today that would constitute wisdom, would reflect godliness, would get you to the end of the day thinking, thank you, Lord, for the headache I've got because of putting 58 job applications in, for the backache I've got because of shoveling gravel for 9 hours.
Yeah.
What could you do that means that you leave this day in a better place than you started it, and the world is in a better state than it was when you started it?
Yeah.
And that's an exercise of freedom, because what you're doing is you're navigating your way through a territory that you are not constrained from, and you're seeking to maximize the expression of wisdom and godliness and maturity in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that's very well kind of stated. There's one other thing too that I haven't fully kind of worked this out, but if
see if we can work it out live, shall we?
There we go. Yeah. You can help me, I'm sure.
Sure.
Since Jesus is the true man, and he's gathering together a new humanity, then we see the ultimate expression of freedom in the God-man. And the God-man dies to himself in order to bring life to the world. Which, as you know, and we've talked about a little bit from 1 Corinthians 15, and Jim brings this up, your hardest boss brings it up as well, that particularly in 1 Corinthians 15, as we were talking about the other evening, there's the natural body, and then there's the spiritual body. And then, we were talking about, Gaffin has that little quote in his book, Resurrection and Redemption. That verse is a thesis in itself. And so you can look back on what Adam was supposed to do in the garden. He was supposed to die to himself and learn obedience that way. And in doing so, he would have become a more glorified man,
right?
Which we see that in Jesus. So back to the freedom discussion then. True freedom then is living out the wisdom of God, which is dying to yourself.
Right.
Excuse me.
So, and the verse you're referring to, the thesis in itself, you think in verse 45, thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being, the last Adam became life-giving spirit. Is that
yeah, I'm pretty sure
it's in that context, right?
Yes, yeah.
Because the contrast there is not just between first and last. So the first man, Adam, became a living being is a quote from Genesis 2.
Yeah.
And then, so first Adam, last Adam, Christ. But it's also a contrast between living and life-giving. And so the glory of the gospel is that we are in communion with one who doesn't just show us how to live, but gives life.
Yeah.
So all of our ethical exhortations are within a framework of saying, this is not you grab yourself by your bootstraps and haul yourself up to the next step. It's not a kind of Petersonian make your bed theology. Yeah. It's you're one with Christ, the risen Lord. You're filled with the same Spirit who fills him. You are remade for fruitful labour. And you might be remade for fruitful labour hacking rocks out of the ground with your bare hands, half a mile underground, like my uncle.
Yeah.
Or you might be remade for fruitful labour in a vocation that the world recognises as important and dignified. You might be made for fruitful labour in one that it should recognise, like motherhood is the classic example of an under-recognised vocation. But whatever it is you're given to do today, you're given that to do in union with Christ, who gives life.
Yeah.
And it's a remarkable... It doesn't just say the first man Adam became a living being, the last Adam became living spirit. It's life-giving spirit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and to me too, that is tremendously helpful when, you're maybe thinking about, maybe you're frustrated at work, or you see things as futile or something like that. It kind of goes back to Luther's milkmaid. God, I don't know exactly remember how he says it, but he doesn't just rain down milk on us. He gives us milk through the working of the milkmaid, who gets up super early in the morning, milks the cow, brings the milk, and then has it delivered to all these places, whatever. Well, that's God working through this woman to give life to the world, to give them milk. And so, insofar as she can see her job that way, as giving life to the world, well, it provides a little bit more, meaning and perspective behind some of the hard tasks that we have to do. That we got to get up early and do this thing, and you might not like it, but when it's life-giving and you're realizing your vocation as a human being in union with Christ, as you were talking about, well, you're not just doing this thing; you're doing this thing to bring life to the world.
I wonder if this is a proper context for thinking about a Christian view of meditation. In other words, what I have in mind is we need to learn to frame or to interpret situations that we find ourselves in, experiences that we have, tasks that we have. We need to frame them in this way. So we need to, let's take your milkmaid. The milkmaid is the agent of God's gift of life to the half a dozen families who depend on her for her work. Her care in keeping the milk clean in medieval Europe will be the thing that stops the 8-month-old baby who's just being weaned onto cow's milk from getting some horrible bacterial infection. She is life to the world.
Yeah.
Or she could just think, it's just exhausting, and I hate this, and it's muck, junk everywhere, and so much of it comes down to the self-awareness of the person who's doing it. And if I think about the kinds of things I want to say to men and women at All Saints, I'd love to be able to infuse them every morning with a little jolt of learn to see the world this way.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's a foolish thought, but for us to meditate, that is, fill our minds with, the contrast with many contemporary meditation and other ancient meditation pursuits is, Christian meditation is you're filling your mind with something. Not emptying your mind. You're not trying to abstract away from your genuine personhood. And if you listen to Sam Harris, the way he describes meditation is that the self disappears, and you become simply your experiences and your awarenesses. That's not what I'm talking about at all.
Absolutely.
What I'm thinking is you become more acutely conscious of your substantial being and of your calling in relation to Christ, and you become equipped to engage in your daily labour as one who is consciously thinking, working as for the Lord, not for men. Through the labour of my hands, I'm stacking steel on the back of a 18-wheeler. Through the labour of my hands, I'm building God's world and creating the infrastructure for homes for people to live in, and in future generations, Christians will be having joyful family meals in an apartment block which is safe to live in because of this steel that I put on the back of this truck. And building God's kingdom is what we're doing.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and I completely agree. There, as you know, but there's a very kind of an easy tendency to discard, the material side of the world, and we have to guard against that. So all of the tangible things that we do,
Yeah, yeah.
everything that we do, can be seen through that lens.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's tremendously helpful. Yeah.
Music. Let's talk about
Sure.
music.
Yeah.
How do we evaluate the aesthetic goodness of music? Why is music important? Why is the longest single book in the Bible a hymn book? Why is it that Christians have always, apparently instinctively, sung? Why is it that as soon as Christians start to think in a structured way about worship, they start to fill their worship services with song and music? What's going on? Why don't we just have a Bible study, Pastor Maney?
Yeah, there you go. Well, of course, you asked like 5 questions there,
That's right.
each of which could be answered at book length, but they're all excellent questions. And I've learned a ton from Ken Myers, really, on things like this. Not that I know it all. The first, I think, was how do you evaluate the aesthetic quality of music?
You don't have to answer the questions in that order, by the way. I'm thinking we should talk about music, but kick off with that question.
Yeah,
I mean, there's just go ahead.
Well, I think there's a couple things here that are helpful. One is to, and this goes back to what we were talking about, the contrast between pop culture and a true culture. But one is to listen to the authorities that we have. They might not be super expert authorities. They might not have a PhD in musicology or something like that. But you probably have, we all know a pianist, a church pianist, somebody who's studied music and trained in music. And they can help you see things in music that the untrained person cannot. Mm-hmm. So, for example, when I was in Louisiana, Jared Ritchie there would do what he called guided listenings. And so we would listen to a piece of music, and simultaneously he would have on the wall, projected on the wall, the sheet music, so you could see what was happening. And every now and then he would pause, and he would pause the whole thing and say, "Now look at this." And I can read music like a little bit, but not a lot. And he'd say, and he would point out, "Now look at how cool this is. This is, like for Bach, he's making the sign of the cross on the sheet music. So he's orchestrating this music, but then from a visual perspective, when you're looking at the music, you actually see this picture of the cross. You're not going to ever see that or hear that or notice that unless somebody who's studied it can kind of bring it to your attention. And I think the same thing is true. I remember I was singing in our church choir in Missouri when I was going to seminary, and the choir director was a fantastic musician, organist, a very, very wonderful man. And we were singing, I forget the actual piece of music, the lyrics of the music, but we were singing it to Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus Meum. Mm-hmm. This is the true, body of Christ or something, whatever the translation is. We were singing a different words, but he was like, "Now listen to this piece. Listen, when we all come to this one chord, we're going to stop and just listen to just how glorious this one chord is." And, if you just sing that or you just learn the bass part or whatever, you don't notice that unless you've got a director there that can say, "Now, guys, you gotta see how incredible this is right here." He would typically call Claude Gudemel, that did a lot of the Genevan Psalter, the first jazz musician, because some of the neat harmonies that that come through in the Psalter. You don't pick up on that unless you are humble enough to listen to somebody who knows it better than you do. So I think that's the first thing. Ken Myers will also talk about, and interestingly too, Ken Myers will also talk about the importance of communities that help to evaluate whether or not something is good or not. And I think that's very, very helpful. So, for example, you can go, you could go to an art museum, and everybody, we all have kind of our particular things that we've been cultivated to like. I like this piece, and you might like that piece a little bit better. But there is a lot of good that comes out in maybe having a group of people look at a painting and notice different things about it in order to evaluate its goodness.
Yes.
And I think that is helpful because it kind of, again, there's a humility aspect here. You're not the sole, judge of whether or not something is good or not, because you just don't see everything, and other people do see things. And so if you can collectively evaluate it, then that can be helpful, I think. Yeah.
I mean, that connects to questions of history, doesn't it? Because one of the things you want to say is that community that has the role of rightly evaluating the beauty and goodness of music is extended through time.
Absolutely.
Chesterton, isn't it? It's Votes for the Dead. We want to democratize properly, which doesn't mean votes for 15-year-olds. It means votes for the church through history.
Yeah.
I mean, this actually helps the vexed question of music and worship.
Yeah.
It can helpfully be addressed in this context. And actually, I think for us here at All Saints, this probably isn't it's probably not a huge issue, maybe not even a tiny issue, because I think my impression is that most people like almost all the music almost all the time. Even everybody likes most of the music almost all the time, I think. And we have sought over the years, since long before my time here, to try to learn to appreciate stuff that comes from former ages. And occasionally I've asked myself, or more often I've been asked by others, well, why don't we sing some more modern songs? And I feel like saying, well, yeah, we could do that. And we actually do sing some. There are some, but we ought not to make our song selection in the same way that Spotify makes your music selection. If you just say, generate an AI playlist that I'm going to like, the likelihood is that they'll be trying you out on Taylor Swift and maybe something really old like Blur, right? Before they start feeding you large amounts of medieval and classical and romantic music.
Yeah.
So, if we think the church has bequeathed us a musical heritage, we've got to find a way of giving heed to that without becoming kind of musical elitists.
Absolutely,
and requiring people to get a degree in classical music performance before they can participate in worship. I think it was Jim, there we go again, who suggested the category of folk music, high folk, as the appropriate goal for church music. So it's not pop, because pop is just whatever is in Flavour of Month this week, and 3 years later it will seem so old hat, it'll just be laughable.
Right.
But neither is it high classical music, so music that requires a degree of, well, maybe a degree in music to perform. There's a place for that as a performance. Maybe you have a kind of choir at Christmas or something. But folk music, the distinctive thing about folk music is that it has both history, it's the evolving inheritance of a community, and the right kind of democratic quality to it. If you imagine the caricature of the medieval pub, without some of the less salubrious elements, the caricature of the country pub is that everybody can go along, and when the fiddle player starts to play his fiddle, everyone can join in. And everyone knows the songs because everyone learned them from Grandad. So if you apply that to church music, what we're wanting to say is that the music that we sing ought to be drawn from a well into which new things are being fed, but it's a historical repository, and we're drawing from it, including the things we've learned to love over as a church community over many years, and going back more decades and centuries.
Sure.
We draw from that, and it should reflect the heritage, the theological and the ecclesial heritage that we want to embrace.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think this is another thing that Ken Myers, I think, is brilliant at, but he shows and interviews people who have really kind of just studied the history of church music very well. And a lot of times Luther would write a new hymn, but he would utilize the tune from an old chant or something. So even if the common man didn't know the meaning of the chant because it's in Latin or whatever, they still would have been accustomed to the chant. And so he adopts this tune. He tweaks it a little bit, and then he puts it to words in the vernacular that the people can sing. And so he's drawing from, but yet adapting. And I think I don't remember any off the top of my head, but I think a lot of some of the better musicians did this. I think Bach did this a lot. A century after Luther, maybe more, he would pick up on some of the early Lutheran chorales and polish them up, change them, tweak them a little bit, and insert them in a cantata or something like that. So,
Do you sing as a family?
We do, yeah. We try to sing a good bit. We've kind of, sometimes we've gone like, a hymn a month or something like that. Or we'll try to do things that kind of nest with the church year a little bit. Yeah. I've tried probably unsuccessfly to try to, we do some, but to chant some psalms, because I think those are very, very helpful to, you memorize them so fast when you can sing them or chant them or something like that. But it's also hard when, that can be a little bit monotonous sometimes, depending on the length of the psalm. So,
I think it's a form of music. I'm thinking of chanting now. Let's just take half a step back.
Yeah.
Why would you chant the Psalms? The answer is because it frees you from the constraints of a conventional melody. So this will be very obvious to musicians, but if I try and explain it in a way that's obvious to people who aren't musicians, I play the piano a bit myself, so I'm sort of in the former category. If you have a conventional tune, then it's got a fixed number of syllables on each line. And so think of a hymn tune, holy, 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 bum, 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 bum.
Yeah.
Right, that's the first line. If you decided, what we want to do is to sing one of the Psalms, hold on a second, the words don't fit. Oh, it's okay, we can just change the words.
Right.
We can produce a paraphrase. And many, many Psalms are paraphrases of that kind, and they're called metrical paraphrases sometimes, because metrical refers to the kind of tune that has that certain meter, which is a reference to the number of syllables in each line. And if you look in a hymn book, if you want to do an experiment, you can find this. Look in the back of a hymn book, there'll be a metrical index of tunes.
Right.
And it basically is a bunch of numbers. So it'll be 6868. That's all of the hymn tunes that have 6 syllables in the first line, then 8, then 6, then 8, or 8888, that's another meter, or 10101010,
right,
or 6666, or 410 or whatever.
Yeah.
Now, if you sing metrical psalms, that's great.
Yeah.
And what you have to do is you have to take the psalms and change the words and paraphrase them so that they fit. And sometimes you have to paraphrase them a bit, and sometimes you have to paraphrase them a lot.
A lot, yeah.
But you can still get the idea of the psalm across. But here's the problem. If you buy what we were talking about earlier, the kernel husk problem, if what you want to say is, there is some value in retaining not just the idea of the psalm, but the particular way it's expressed, you're probably going to lose that through paraphrase.
Yeah. Yeah.
You could keep it if you had a form of tune that allowed you to vary the number of syllables in each line. Because then you could sing anything.
Yeah.
You just have to decide when to change notes.
Right.
So what chanting does is it gives you a tune, and one I always remember from my Anglican days as a kid is da 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 da. Right? But you can sing any number of syllables on any one of those notes.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm not going to try and do it now, but you could just get Psalm 1, and you could make a couple of marks in the text to tell you when to change notes, and then you could chant Psalm 1 exactly as it is in the ESV or exactly as it is in the NRSV or whatever, King James, whatever you wanted. You could chant any words to any chant tune.
Yeah.
Now, what's the cost of that? Well, one cost is it's just hard to do. It's harder to do than to just sing a hymn, because with a hymn you know already that every syllable you see on the page automatically gets a new note. Whereas with a chant, you've got to know the tune, and you've got to know the word, be able to read the words, just like with a normal hymn. But you've also got to pay attention to when the note changes. So you've got an extra thing to think about.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a little bit harder.
Yeah.
The other point to bear in mind is you're still only getting the ESV, right?
Yeah.
You're not getting the Hebrew. So some of the chanting advocates, I just want to dial them back half a notch and say, listen, let's not make too much of a grandiose claim for getting exactly what the Word of God says in some kind of absolute sense, because we've all got translations, and our translations are all different, and there are debates about translations. So, but that said, I think we're all going to agree that the ESV is a little bit closer to the Greek and Hebrew text than the New Living Translation or the Message, right?
Yeah.
And metrical paraphrases are to the Message what chanting is to the ESV, let's say.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, Yeah, and I think too, there's work involved. There is some learning, because most of us didn't grow up chanting psalms. I certainly didn't. I might have told you this, but I went to a Theophilus course, probably 10 years ago or something. Actually, Ken Myers was teaching it on music, and so there you go. But that was my first time chanting psalms, and if you had asked me to chant psalms before then, I'd say, man, you're Roman Catholic or something. I'm not doing that. But then, so if you go to a Theophilus course, you have a morning, noon, and evening prayer, and it's very structured, and you chant psalms. And so over a 5-day course, I probably had 5 or 6 psalms memorized, and so there's a learning curve, but once you kind of get into the groove a little bit, then you realize, man, there's a lot of benefits to this, and it can be done beautifully. I think there's some instruction that has to take place on how to sing beautifully when you're maybe singing multiple words on one note, and that's why I think the Theophilus guys have they've got Paul Buckley and Brian Motes that kind of travel around and teach how can this be a beautiful thing as opposed to just sounding kind of awkward. So
I think that's a very real concern, I think, for many people. It's the learning curve coupled with the one shot, or it could be embarrassing, factor of a worship service. It's like, even if you got a church of 350 or 400 people in the congregation, and 100 of them are down in the fellowship hall, 150 of them are down in the fellowship hall, everyone's had that experience, maybe at a church they visited, or maybe once or twice in their own home church, of the hymn starts and it's like, okay, this is going to be painful. Nobody knows a tune. Who picked this? And to have that in a situation where you can't easily pick it up, like with chanting a psalm, just doubles down on the awkwardness factor.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think you're right there about, there's value in some instruction, but at the same time, I think to a certain extent we need to get over ourselves. And what I really think is the way to parse the problem of singing it well is to say, look, those of us who do know how to do it have really got to belt it out.
Yeah.
Like we've got to do that all the time.
Yeah.
We shouldn't think of singing in church as singing along with the congregation. You should want your voice to be heard by the person next to you.
Yeah.
And if you all do that, you'll lift the volume to a point where it is really resonant. And almost anything sounds good if it's sung with enthusiasm, and almost nothing sounds good if it's sung weakly, right?
Yeah. Oh, as you were talking about lifting, I have this memory of singing "Now Shall My Inward Joys Arise." Are you familiar with that one?
Do you want to sing it for us?
Maybe. Well, I'll see if I have the guts for it. But I was singing that, and I was standing next to Yuri Brito.
Oh, wow.
And I literally felt like we were lifting off, because he just has such a powerful, and pretty voice, beautiful voice.
It's a great voice, yeah.
But I mean, literally, it felt
we
like
should get him on the podcast.
We were lifting.
Yeah. We should get you. I've actually had him on before, just talking about CREC stuff.
Gotcha.
Yeah. The biblical text I always remember in this connection is Judges 4 and 5. And I've talked about this before once or twice, but if you look at Judges 4, it's the narrative. The first part is the narrative of Deborah and Barak.
Right.
And what's going on is Barak ought to be the judge, but Deborah has to step up because Barak is just as a feeble, weak, indecisive, cowardly leader.
Yeah.
And he finally leads the people into battle, but his first word is if, and he says, if you will go with me, I will go. And so he's like, and in the end it's Deborah and then Jael later in the chapter who are the heroines. They're the ones who actually lead the people. And it's an image of what happens when masculine leadership fails. Like men who are not able to lead end up requiring women to do things that ought to be the work of the men, and it's a manifestation of masculine failure. Now then what happens is really fascinating when you go to Judges chapter 5, because that's the song of Deborah and Barak. And the text says Deborah and Barak sang this song before the Lord or something, and the verb to sing, you'd expect the verb to sing to be a plural verb because it's Deborah and Barak. The verb is feminine singular.
Interesting.
It is such a pointed dig at Barak. And so the picture you've got to imagine is Deborah and Barak are there leading the people in singing the song of Deborah and Barak. And Deborah is doing the Yuri Brito thing. She's like belting this thing out. Just and Barak is like, So it's just this fascinating connection then, biblically, between men who sing loudly enough to be heard and men who are fit to lead. And it's absolutely unmistakable in the pages of Scripture. And if you think about it emotionally, what it feels like to do that, when you do what Yuri Brito does, and really, I think there are a number of guys at All Saints who do this, and maybe I want to encourage a few more of you to kind of lift your voices. When you lift your voices sufficiently loudly that you can be heard, you feel exposed. You feel like a slight sense of awkwardness, which is precisely the feeling that you feel when you're leading anything. If you're leading, let's say, a business, certainly if you're leading a church, if you're trying to lead your family, if you're making decisions which affect others, leadership feels exposed. You feel like, man, everyone knows the buck stops with me. If you've been, we've been in positions in church leadership. I've been in positions in church leadership where, the other guys have contributed their thoughts, and in the end, for whatever reason, the decision might lie with me. And it's like, well, okay, I've got to get this right then, and you feel somewhat exposed. And I'm sure that men who've been in business or family roles that entail leadership know that kind of experience. So it tracks onto the feeling of being in church on Sunday morning being prepared to sing loudly enough, that somebody next to you goes, like that, yes. And if we all do that, of course, it'll lift the roof, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
But if we shrink back from it because we don't want to be noticed, that is the psychological profile of somebody who cannot lead.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to be noticed. If you don't want to be noticed, you're never going to lead anything or anyone.
It's a good point. You know, as you were talking about this, it's interesting, and it's interesting to me how so many things come back to the Lord's service on Sunday morning. You know, when you were talking about how it's kind of insulting to your wife when you just eat in 8 minutes. What we want to have is a meal. We don't just want, an IV where we get nutrients injected into us. We want the communal aspect, the communal side of eating together, sharing conversation. I was talking with some of the men the other night about the wonderful lady, Gisela Kreglinger. She's a German. She grew up on an old family winery in Bavaria for generations. And, the winery's been in the family for generations. And she became a theologian, and she kind of has brought the two worlds together. So she's brought wine and food with theology together. Wonderful work. But I remember, I forget exactly where it is in her book, The Soul of Wine. She's got two kind of main ones, the spirituality of wine, the soul of wine. She's done some stuff with George MacDonald as well. Great theologian. But anyway, she talks about, when you bring two glasses together to toast or something like that, well, there's a physical sound there, and it's the sound of celebration and relaxation and feasting. And so much of that we just we forget about. We just think that's kind of like ancillary, but it's actually, that's the substance of community, is this physical stuff. So, in the Lord's service, we're having this communal meal with God, and we're enjoying, even though it's a small portion, but we're enjoying a portion of bread representing the body of Christ. And this cultural, both of these are cultural products, bread that had to be made and wine that had to be fermented, and it takes time, that represents the blood of Christ. So we're having this incredibly meaningful celebratory meal, and that shapes the way that we think about everything. And then you were talking about singing. That's what we do in the Lord's service. The Lord's service is truly where we are formed into the type of people that then go out into the world to do the work that God's given us.
That's such a powerful and important insight. You know what I'd like to do? I know we've got you here for a few more days. What I'm going to suggest is we press pause on this conversation now.
Okay.
We go and refill these coffee mugs.
Sounds good.
We're going to come back in 5-10 minutes and invite you guys to come back in 7 days and listen to part 2. And what we'll kick off with is that insight that the Lord's service is the archetype of the whole of our lives.
Yeah.
What I'd really love to do in that context is to first explain why our worship services have the shape they do, and then really dig deep into how the different elements of our service affect and shape the rest of our lives. I'm conscious that at All Saints there are lots of people who've been worshipping with us for a long time, and they kind of got the hang of why we do things this way. But there are people joining us all the time for whom this is a bit odd. Why do we kneel, and why do we have this stand-sit stuff, and why do we have the liturgy structured how we do?
Sure.
So if I can prevail upon you to join me back here in 10 minutes, and you guys to join us back here in 7 days when part 2 of the podcast comes out, we'll have some refilled coffee mugs, and we'll talk about that.
Sounds good.
Drew Maney, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
And thank you for being here. The Lord bless you. Bye for now.